2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later. So much later, the Leonid Kataya waiting at the Hatta Haya and you one. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several pounds later. 70 years later. Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later the same year. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 minute 47 seconds later. 1 bit of slowly later. 1 pair of bands later. 8 hours later. 4298,000 pages later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. It's the next day. Meanwhile, and it goes to crab. 10 seconds later. 3-4-6 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Tuesday. 5 minutes later. 44 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 50 minutes later. 7 months later. 1,040 years later. 16 paranoia 5 days later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 exchange women of his shift later. 2 minutes later. 3 hours later. 1 week later. The following day. Meanwhile, later. Just said. One powers is a weak Taj Modash. Your joy is a weak Taj Modash. Rewind at the back, they were ones. 1 Wilson was doing later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Later, anyway. Approximately 10 hours later.